Hello Year 10 and welcome to Remote Learning Task 15. In this task we will be exploring what life was like for minority groups in Nazi Germany. Now, I'm going to get you to read slides 3 to 8 because they will help you complete this mix and match activity. So you need to match the definition to the correct term. Please do not simply write the letter and number in your book. You need to make sure that you have clear notes for you to revise from. The next few slides are quite full. You don't need to take loads and loads of notes. You don't actually need to take any notes if you so wish. You can just complete this task as a record of you reading those notes. So what was life like for minority groups in Nazi Germany? Now, Nazi policies were intended to make the German state as strong as possible. We've seen that policies for German children, women, workers, justice, churches and art were all shaped for the service of the German state to strengthen it. The Nazis also believed that to make the German state strong, the German population needed to be strong. This belief affected their policy towards minority groups. It was a belief with two strands: eugenics and racial hygiene. Now, the Nazis used eugenics to justify their policies. Eugenics is the science of selective breeding. It became popular in Europe from the 1880s. Scientists took the ideas of Darwin, who explained that species changed over time through evolution. Darwin explored how these changes could be controlled to produce better human beings. The Nazis took these ideas and applied them to their policies. Eugenics became a subject in schools. They also encouraged reproduction by the best Germans and prevented those they considered unsuitable. They achieved this by sterilising them. That is a medical procedure that stops you from having children. Racial hygiene was also used to justify Nazi policies. Now, as you've just seen, eugenics is about selecting the best parents from any race. The Nazis took this a stage further. They wanted to choose the best parents from just one race, the Aryan race. The Aryan race described by the Nazis came from a specific part of Europe, and the Nazis believed that they were superior to all other races. Because of this, they adopted policies to make Germany as Aryan as possible. In schools, in the Hitler Youth, and in propaganda, the Nazis taught racial hygiene, the idea that Aryan Germans should only reproduce with other Aryans to make their offspring pure Aryan, unspoiled by any other racial characteristics. They applied this belief to their policies and even passed laws to prevent mixed-race marriages. Anti-Semitism. Now, Nazi ideas about eugenics and racial hygiene were particularly focused towards Jews. Anti-Jewish views, sometimes called anti-Semitism, had been common throughout Europe for many, many centuries and for a number of different reasons. Sometimes anti-Jewish sentiment was motivated by the fact that some saw the Jews as standing out as different because of their religion, custom and looks. Some Christians hated Jews as they blamed them for the execution of Christ. Some Jews were very successful in finance and business, and that led to a lot of jealousy and hatred towards them. Now, by the 1930s, anti-Semitism had become particularly strong in Germany, and there are a number of reasons for this. Again, you don't need to write every single bit of this down. You can just use it to understand the motivations for the Nazi policies. An attempt to promote German nationalism led to anti-Semitism. Now, this could have been positive in the sense that they were promoting German heroes in mythology, music and science, but there was also negative sides of it. So it often led to the identification of people that weren't German, so enemies of Germany, like the British Empire, communism, minority groups, such as Jews. Now, this stemmed from the fact that Germany was only united as a single country in 1871, so there were lots of efforts to try and unite them, and there was a heightened sense of German nationalism. Another reason for anti-Semitism was that when things are hard, people often look for a scapegoat. They look for someone to blame, and that correlated with World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, hyperinflation, and the economic depression. And they were all blamed on the Jews by German nationalist politicians. Hitler was one of many nationalist politicians in Germany who hated the Jews. His own bitterness towards Jews was given complete freedom when he came to power in 1933, hence the increase in anti-Semitism. Germans with more moderate views, so less extreme, allowed themselves to be influenced by Nazi propaganda, and they turned a blind eye to it, or even participated in the Nazi persecution of Jews. So these are all reasons as to why anti-Semitism increased in the 1930s. Hitler's views. Now, in 1925, Hitler set out his racial views in Mein Kampf. He claimed that there was a hierarchy of races. He believed the Aryan race was superior, so better than, other races, and this was called the Herrenvolk or master race. They're often portrayed as tall, blonde, blue-eyed and athletic. Other races, such as the Slavs of Eastern Europe, were Untermenschen, that means subhuman. The worst of the Untermenschen, in Hitler's view, were gypsies and Jews. Hitler deemed them Lebensunwert, which means unworthy of life. Just to reiterate, task 1 is a match activity, so you can rewind the video, pause it, whatever you need to do to allow you to complete this task. Okay, for task 2, you are going to create a timeline to plot the persecution of minorities and Jews from 1933 to 1939. Above the line, you need to record the events showing the persecution of minority groups, and below the line, you need to record the events showing the persecution of the Jews. Now, the information for this will be on the next slides. As you read it, bear in mind that persecution is ill treatment or hostility towards a particular group, either because of their beliefs, customs, or something that makes them different. An example of this will be modelled for you after each slide, so you understand what's expected of you. Slavs. Now, these were an ancient tribe of people who migrated into Europe from the east. Their modern descendants are found in large areas of Eastern Europe. By the 1930s, many people of Slavic origin lived in Germany. Nazi propaganda and school lessons constantly told Germans that the Slavs were Untermenschen, that means subhuman. The Nazis insisted that, like Jews and Gypsies, they were of a different origin from Aryan Germans and needed to be treated differently. Oh, there's a spelling mistake there, bear with me. That's better. The Nazis threatened to invade Slav countries in Eastern Europe for Lebensraum, extra living space, for Germany's people. However, before World War II, Slavs were persecuted less than some other minorities. So you might want to take a moment to pause the video, reread this information and work out where is there persecution against the Slavs. Because you don't need to write all of this, you just need to identify where there is persecution. And here is an example of what I'd like you to do on the timeline. So the next group that faced persecution were the Gypsies. This is the name used by the Nazis for the Roma people. They typically lived an itinerant lifestyle, travelling from place to place. There are about 26,000 Gypsies in Germany in the early 1930s. The Nazis believed they did not work enough or contribute enough taxes. They believed that Gypsies posed a threat to the racial purity of Germany. After 1933, Gypsies were often arrested as social nuisances and sent to concentration camps. From 1936, some were forced to live in special camps. One camp in Berlin contained 600 Gypsies who had been forcibly rounded up. For 600 people, there were 2 toilets, 3 water taps, and no electricity. In 1938, Gypsies were banned from travelling in groups. They were rounded up and put on a register of Gypsies and tested for racial characteristics. If they failed the test, they lost German citizenship and social benefits. In 1939, orders were given to prepare all Gypsies for deportation. This meant that they would be forcibly removed from Germany. Pause the video, work out what you're going to plot for the persecution that Gypsies faced. Here you have a scaffolded version of the timeline to help you. So these are the different points at which there is persecution. Go back to this slide and work out what you're going to plot for each of these. The next group that faced persecution were the homosexuals. The Nazis believed that homosexuals lowered moral standards and spoiled the purity of the German race. In 1935, the Nazis strengthened the laws against homosexuality. As a result, 766 males were imprisoned for homosexuality. In 1936, this number was over 4,000. In 1938, it was 8,000. Released homosexual prisoners were often sent to concentration camps. 5,000 German homosexuals died there. Nazi laws also encouraged the voluntary castration of homosexuals. So again, you may wish to pause the video to work out what you're going to plot in terms of the persecution that this group are facing. You have a differentiated version of the timeline to help you there. The Nazis believed that people with disabilities were a burden on society and that they weakened racial purity. In 1933, the Nazis passed the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring. This made it compulsory for people to be sterilised if they were mentally ill, alcoholic, deformed, epileptic, deaf or blind. 400,000 people were sterilised by 1939. In 1939, the Nazis ordered that babies with severe mental or physical disabilities should be killed by starvation or lethal overdose of drugs. This became known as the T4 programme. Eventually, juveniles up to 17 years old with disabilities were included in this, and 5,000 children with disabilities were killed. So pause the video, work out what you're going to plot on the timeline. Again, there is a scaffolded version on the next slide. The next category we're going to move on to is the persecution of the Jews. You will remember from the task instructions that this persecution must be plotted below the line. There were only 437,000 Jews in Germany in 1933. That is less than 1% of the population. But before Hitler became Chancellor in 1933, he made it very clear that action against the Jews would be a priority. As the Nazis gradually took control of education, the press, and the arts, Nazi propaganda calling Jews vermin and filth and describing them as evil and scheming flooded Germany through schools, newspapers, and films. It is difficult to know how this propaganda affected the treatment of Jews by ordinary Germans, but where the Nazis had influence, they began to discriminate against Jews. Jews were gradually excluded from positions of power or wealth, and there are going to be some examples on the next slide. From April 1933, Jews were banned from government jobs and Jewish civil servants and teachers were sacked. From September 1933, Jews were banned from inheriting land. From May 1935, Jews were banned from the army. Nazis who controlled local councils began to follow the lead of the Nazi government. From 1934, some local councils banned Jews from parks and swimming pools. Others provided separate yellow park benches for Jews to keep normal Germans safe. So you may wish to pause the video here to plot some of these examples of persecution on your timeline, but below the line. One aspect of this early persecution of Jews was a Nazi campaign against Jewish shops and businesses. On the 30th of March 1933, the Nazi Party announced that from 10 a.m. on the 1st of April, an official boycott would begin of all Jewish businesses, doctors and lawyers. That means that the Nazi Party were calling for German people not to use Jewish shops, businesses, etc. SA stormtroopers were sent in to paint Jewish stars and the word Judah, Jew, outside Jewish businesses. They then stood outside with banners discouraging people from going inside. As the Nazis established themselves in power, persecution became worse. On the 15th of September 1935, a set of changes called the Nuremberg Laws were passed. Two of these laws increased the persecution of Jews. The Reich Law on Citizenship. This stated that only those of German blood could be German citizens. Jews became German subjects, not citizens. They lost the rights of citizenship, the right to vote, and the right to hold government office or German passports. The Reich Law for the protection of German blood and honour. This law forbade Jews from marrying German citizens and forbade sexual relations between Jews and German citizens. From 1938, matters became even worse and more ominous for Jews. From March 1938, Jews had to register all of their possessions, making it easier for the government to take them away. From July 1938, Jews had to carry identity cards, making it easier for them to be persecuted. And then, in November 1938, persecution of the Jews became even worse. On the 7th of November 1938, a 17-year-old Polish Jew, Herschel Greenspan, went into the German embassy in Paris, randomly picked a German, Ernst von Rath, and shot him. Greenspan was angry at the Germans for the way they had treated his parents. Seriously wounded, von Rath was rushed to hospital. On the 8th of November, Goebbels used the incident to stir up trouble against the Jews in Germany. He ordered the local newspapers in Hanover, Greenspan's hometown, to print articles condemning the Paris shooting. He also used the SA, SS and Gestapo to attack local synagogues and the houses of local Jews. Then things escalated. On the 9th of November, Ernst von Rath died. Goebbels told Hitler the news on the afternoon of the 9th of November. They agreed to turn violence against the Jews in Hanover into a nationwide attack. Nazi leaders were encouraged to arrange attacks on Jews and their property, but were told to do so undercover. Police were told not to prevent any violence against Jews by members of the public. Instructions were also sent to local SS groups to arrest as many Jews as the prisons could take. On the 9th and 10th of November, gangs smashed and burnt Jewish property and attacked Jews. An example of this violence included one 18-year-old Jew being thrown from a third-floor window. Some gangs were in Nazi uniforms, others were SA and Hitler Youth, although they had been told not to wear uniforms so that it would seem the violence was from the general public. Some Germans were horrified, others watched with pleasure or joined in. Official figures, which underestimate the damage, listed 814 shops, 171 homes and 191 synagogues destroyed. The damage was so bad that these events were called Kristallnacht, Crystal Night, or the Night of Broken Glass. Goebbels blamed the Jews for starting trouble on Kristallnacht and announced that they would be punished. Jews were fined 1 billion marks to pay for the damage. By the 12th of November, 20,000 Jews had been rounded up and sent to concentration camps. Now, there is a clip here from The Book Thief, which you may have watched in Key Stage 3. It is a recreation of Kristallnacht from 1 minute 22 to about 2 minutes 10. Viewer discretion is advised because some may find these scenes very distressing. In January 1939, the Nazis decided to evict all Jews from Germany. The Reich Office for Jewish Emigration was set up under Reinhard Heydrich, head of the Gestapo. His task was to deport Germany's Jews. To achieve this, in April 1939, orders went out that all Jews should be evicted from their homes and collected together for deportation. This was how things stood when the Second World War broke out in September 1939. Again, you may wish to go back and work out what you're going to plot on your timeline to track the persecution of Jews. The Nazi government kept atrocities against Jews secret. However, most of what happened to Jews between 1933 and 1939 was known, both within Germany and in other countries. Indeed, many Germans took part in the persecution, and many others, and most other countries, did little to stop it. This is difficult to understand. As we have seen, people who criticised the Nazis were severely dealt with. Some Germans may therefore have been too scared to oppose it. Others convinced themselves that the suffering inflicted on the Jews was not real, or just ignored it entirely. But many Germans seem to have been convinced by ideas at the time that the persecution of Jews was justified. So they supported it and even took part in it. Once you have produced your timeline based on the persecution of different groups, I would like you to complete task 3. Look at the timeline, write a paragraph to explain why 1933, 1935 and 1938 are key dates in the Nazi persecution of the Jews. Why are those particular dates important? Use examples from your timeline to support your answer. Once you have done that, you have completed Remote Learning Task 15, your final remote learning task. Remember that you have your walking talking mock, which is ongoing. As soon as you have written your exam answers, please submit them to your teacher via Teams or email so we can mark them and give you feedback. Remember, this is going to be really important to practice paper 3 because this will be on your GCSE exam next year.